Chapter 8. The Dennis Rodman of Hockey, Ray Emery and the Policing of Blackness in the Great White North. By Stacey L. Lawrence and Rod Murray. Racism is not in the National Hockey League. Of all the sports in the world, it's the one that doesn't have racism. Don Cherry. Speaking from his pulpit on Hockey Night in Canada's Coach's Corner, the most watched segment on Canadian television, the infamous Don Cherry made this proclamation denying the existence of racism in professional hockey. Cherry's remarks were a response to an article that appeared in the Globe and Mail in which Ted Nolan reflected upon the racism he endured throughout his career as an Aboriginal, Ojibwa First Nation, hockey player and coach. Countering Nolan's claims of racism, Cherry stated, "It's not that it's racism, it's that Nolan is tough to fire." Uncharacteristically apologizing for putting it bluntly, Cherry concluded that Nolan is a GM killer. Ever the one to try to soften the tone of Cherry's comments, co-host Ron MacLean then offered some clarity by explaining that racism wasn't the issue, it was that, you get blackballed because you don't play the game. Not playing the game the way the moral vanguard thinks it should be played, on and off the playing surface, has posed a number of problems for the people running professional sports in recent years. For example, in the fall of 2005, the National Basketball Association, NBA, imposed a strict, off-court dress code because too many of the league's emerging stars were dressing in urban, hip-hop style. With black players constituting a significant majority of NBA rosters, the dress code quickly became part of a wider discussion about racial politics, marketing, and black style in the sport. Since the new dress regulations targeted the clothing and jewelry, or bling in the current vernacular, favored by a group of young black players, allegations of racism were raised by some NBA players and media commentators. However, according to league officials, the dress code was in no way racially motivated, it was simply about bringing professionalism back into basketball in order to rehabilitate the NBA's image among, mainly white, fans, sponsors, and advertisers. The NBA began to embrace rap music and other elements of hip-hop style in the early 1980s, and the league was a trailblazer in terms of its promotion of black players and its efforts to sell black culture to white America. In the words of Dave Zirin, the NBA essentially became the hip-hop league, not running from associations with urban culture but marketing them to death. By the early 2000s, however, there was a growing sense that the NBA might have gone too far in this direction, to the point that the league was becoming too ghetto. The dress code adopted in 2005 to 2006 is therefore part of a bigger backlash against the hip-hop ball or a wider racialized culture war connected to such issues as the disappointing performance of U.S. national teams in international tournaments, the arrest of a number of black NBA players, and, in particular, the 2004 brawl at the Palace of Auburn Hills involving members of the Detroit Pistons and Indiana Pacers, including Ron Artest, which spilled into the stands and included altercations with a group of spectators. As Zirin writes, the NBA higher-ups fear that the public views pro ballers as one step removed from the yard at Rikers Island. They are concerned that Main Street USA thinks the league is too gangsta, too hip-hop, too urban, all of which is code for too young, black, and scary. While approximately 75% of NBA players are African American, only about 2.5% of players in the National Hockey League, NHL, are black. In 2003 to 2004, for example, just 17 black players skated in the NHL. However, despite these differences in the racial composition of the two leagues, both the NBA and the NHL dealt with what they perceived as problems involving the behavior and public image of black players during the 2005 to 2006 season. Shortly after the furor over the NBA dress code erupted in October 2005, a parallel controversy developed in hockey over similar means of personal expression. Ray Emery, a goaltender with the Ottawa Senators, is black. And, if you asked the Senators' management, they would probably tell you that he was acting like it, too. Over the course of the 2005 to 2006 season, Emery was questioned and criticized on several occasions for behaviors and style choices that, like those of many NBA players, could be considered too hip-hop. For example, Emery's decisions to get another graffiti art tattoo, dye his hair platinum blonde, and, finally, paint the image of Mike Tyson on his goalie mask drew the ire of team management. With blacks and other people of color forming only a small minority of players in the NHL, the hip-hop backlash in hockey was neither as threatening nor as widespread as that in basketball. However, while the case of Ray Emery was not sufficient to elicit a league-wide response, the treatment of this gangsta goalie was comparable to the NBA dress code in that ultimately it was white cultural norms that were being recentered and reinforced by policing forms of black expression. This chapter explores cultural conversations about race and blackness in Canadian sport by examining media narratives surrounding Ottawa Senators goaltender Ray Emery during the 2005-2006 NHL season. Newspaper reports and commentary related to Emery between December 2005 and April 2006 form the basis of this case study. Case studies have a long and impressive record as a sound methodological approach in the social sciences. They are particularly noted for their ability to initiate the process of discovery. While researchers are limited in the generalizations that they can draw, case studies are nonetheless especially useful for intensively examining and understanding a single case, engaging in theoretical analysis, and generating insights and hypotheses that may be explored in subsequent studies. The 2005-2006 hockey season serves as a useful case study for investigating the contested meanings of race in contemporary sport. The controversy that enveloped Ray Emery can be seen as a magnified moment in the social and cultural construction and containment of blackness in the Great White North. Media coverage of Emery and other black athletes during this time period shaped and reflected a range of racial discourses that will be assessed in this chapter. Our analysis draws upon ideas and methods used in a number of other historical and sociological studies of sports media narratives. Like other scholars who have used textual analysis of sports coverage to shed light on various dimensions of modern sport, our goal is to read sport in the following way. As a methodology for cultural analysis, reading sport compels us to read in a different, more theoretically charged manner. The methodology of reading sport, that is, of finding the cultural meanings that circulate within narratives of particular incidents or celebrities, also requires critical attention to the ways that sexuality, race, gender, and class privileges are articulated in those accounts. This study applies these insights and methodologies to media accounts of several contentious issues and events involving Ray Emery in 2005-2006. More specifically, this chapter uses the highly charged public debate that occurred around the NBA dress code as a backdrop against which the parallel controversies surrounding similar racialized forms of expression in the NHL can be read. Our analysis of the popular media narratives related to these flashpoint events reveals that racialized constructions of black athletes as menacing, criminal, and dangerously different were prominent in coverage of both hockey and basketball. Although the NHL and the NBA are seemingly worlds apart, especially in regard to the presence of black players, we suggest that the various forms, expressions, and effects of racism are similar in these two sports, as well as in Canada and the United States more generally. In particular, we argue that criticisms of Ray Emery are part of the broader practice of policing young black males who defy dominant expectations. In the end, the NBA and the NHL's Ottawa Senators made comparable efforts to discipline and contain the threatening black bodies under their control. Media representations and the new racism. In Reading Sport, Critical Essays on Power and Representation, Susan Burrell and Mary G. MacDonald write, racial and ethnic relations scholarship begins with the insight that race is a social construction and that racial meanings are constantly being refigured in accordance with and in contrast to the fluid new racism of contemporary American popular culture. Earlier studies that focused on the cultural forces that work to exclude members of racial and ethnic minorities from sport have been joined by efforts to document ways in which raced bodies are represented in sport. This study assesses cultural representations of blackness in the NHL in relation to contemporary forms of racism in North American society. Drawing upon insights derived from theories of the new racism and what Francis Henry and Carol Tater call democratic racism, we analyze efforts to curtail some of Ray Emery's office activities and self-representations as part of a bigger project to put black male bodies and styles under surveillance and control. In particular, we look at the ways in which race and racism are downplayed or denied in such situations in order to maintain white privilege and dominance. We also pay special attention to specific conditions in Canada and in the sport of hockey. As Gamal Abdel Shahid states, Canadian national identity and the sense of belonging works only via the policing, disciplining, and regulation of those marked as outsiders, or non-citizens. Similarly, Stephen J. Jackson describes how the Canadian media constructed black sprinter Ben Johnson as the other and as a threat to the imagined Canadian community. We argue that Ray Emery can be seen as one of these dangerous outsiders. As a result, this research also addresses important gaps in the study of race and sport in a Canadian context, and, in particular, the need for additional examinations of the role of racism and racialized identities in Canadian hockey. Francis Henry and Carol Tater identify democratic racism as one particular variant of the new racism. Democratic racism arises when racist beliefs and behaviors remain deeply embedded in democratic societies. Obfuscations and justifications are deployed to demonstrate continuing faith in egalitarian ideals, even while many individuals, groups, and institutions continue to engage in systemic racist practices that serve to undermine those ideals. In addition, they suggest that the new forms of racism are discursive and that democratic racism is demonstrated most clearly through the discourses of dominance. To examine this form of the new racism, we require sensitive analytic tools to identify how racialized and racist meanings are woven into media presentations and reproduced through them. This case study takes up Henry and Tater's challenge by assessing the meanings woven into newspaper coverage of Ray Emery. These media representations, and misrepresentations, both mirror and construct a number of racialized discourses and racial filters that contribute to the prevalence of democratic racism in North American society today. The discourses that underpin democratic racism in contemporary culture include the discourse of otherness, the discourse of denial, and the discourse of color blindness. These discourses, frames, and filters will be examined throughout this study as we analyze a range of media narratives related to cultural perceptions of race in hockey. Ray Emery, hip-hop meets hockey. Then along comes a cockroach-eating goalie who dresses like a gangsta rapper and shows up at practice doing a Dennis Rodman impersonation. Ken Campbell. Razor Ray Emery was not the first black player to play in the NHL. The Jackie Robinson of hockey is a title held by Willie O'Ree, who broke into the league amid very little fanfare back in 1958. O'Ree appeared in 45 NHL games during parts of 2 seasons between 1958 and 1961, and, as Steve Peiken points out, the next black player in the NHL would not appear for more than another decade. Since then, only about 40 other black hockey players have skated on NHL ice, though about half of this group has entered the league since 1991. Hidden underneath the oversized pads and full mask worn as a goaltender, Emery's blackness is potentially less evident than the dark skin and long dreadlocks of Anson Carter or Georges Larac. Nevertheless, Ken Warren of the Ottawa Citizen points out that Emery cuts a striking figure as he steps into the Ottawa Senators' dressing room. On the day of this particular interview, Emery is wearing a shockingly bright white track suit, drawing attention to the diamond stud earring flashing from his right earlobe. It is a look that is in stark contrast to the standard jeans sweatshirt ball cap outfit favored by most NHL players on practice days. Naturally, it only takes a few seconds for the first catcall to come from across the room. "Hey, T.O., yells Senators star center Jason Spezza, referring to flamboyant and controversial National Football League wide receiver Terrell Owens. If Emery hears the wisecrack from his good friend, he ignores it. But it isn't just on this day that Emery's style of dress has stood out from what is typical of his peers in the hockey world. Emery's uniqueness was already evident to many of the people in the Ottawa Senators organization at an after-party hosted by the team in Florida during the 2001 NHL Draft. Jason Spezza, chosen second overall by Ottawa, was a little bit anxious about meeting all the scouts and front office staff of his new organization. First impressions being what they are, Spezza put on a crisp new golf shirt, freshly pressed slacks, and arrived early. Some while later, the kid the Sens had grabbed in the 4th round, 99th overall, sauntered in wearing baggy blue shorts, a t-shirt that hung to his knees and a ball cap perched sideways atop his head. Spezza didn't know what to think, other than what every ounce of sense was telling him: whoever this guy was, Spezza would be avoiding him. The dominant discourse framing media narratives of Emery is what Henry and Tater call the discourse of otherness. Despite being born and raised in Canada and developing his skills in the Canadian hockey system, Emery is constructed as an outsider or a threatening other. As Henry and Tater explain, the ubiquitous "we" represents the white dominant culture or the culture of the organization. They refers to the communities that are the other, and that possess different, i.e., undesirable, values, beliefs, and norms. Although Emery's race is rarely mentioned explicitly, his blackness is always present, but it is framed as attitude or style. Abdel Shahid makes a similar observation about Canadian basketball, noting that contentions of racism in the men's national basketball program were erased by displacing race with notions of place and playing style, rooted in the inner city. In effect, this made allegations of racism impossible. Eduardo Bonilla Silva captures the subtle and apparently non-racial ways in which this marking of blackness occurs when he suggests that colorblind racism otherizes softly. In contrast to the typical, white, hockey player, Emery is portrayed as a bit of a bad boy who listens to hard gangster rap, brings his flashy pinstriped suits on road trips, and drives a limited edition white Hummer. He is strange and different, fitting uneasily into the world of hockey. Emery is Rodman, or T.O. more NBA or NFL than NHL. The following profile captures this sense of otherness clearly, explaining how Emery is fashioning his own distinct style as he strives to be Ottawa's franchise goaltender for a long time. Over the years, the culture of hockey has created a one-for-all and all-for-one mantra as a necessary part of teamwork. That has tended to breed conservatism in players away from the ice. With a few exceptions, players generally dress, walk and talk from the same playbook. Then there's Emery. "I have different interests," he says as he relaxes in his luxurious new downtown condo. "Even when I was a kid, I was in different crowds because of what I liked, and how I dressed. I like to be a bit unique. I like everything in music, I like to try different things out. If you look in my closet, I've got some rap stuff, some bandanas, but then I have tight European suits. I like different aspects of different cultures." At the same time, some of these media discourses connected Emery to stereotypes of young black men as criminals and gang members. With his bling, baggy shorts, and bandanas, Emery can be equated to the professional basketball players who are in need of the dress code's discipline. For instance, Los Angeles Lakers coach Phil Jackson observed that, during the NBA playoffs, you'll have a player step to the podium wearing a do-rag and sunglasses and holding a child on his lap, and it sends out an image, I don't know, of prison garb or thuggery or smells of defiance in a way. An editorial in the Windsor Star offered a more critical perspective on such stereotypes, noting, "A dress code specifically designed to clean up young black players so they're not mistaken for punks only reinforces the prejudice that black men sporting baggy pants and throwback jerseys are just seconds away from a mugging or other crime." Just as the NBA was concerned about defiant black males in unsettling gangster gear, it appears that Emery's white teammates, and perhaps the reporters who covered them, thought they might be better off steering clear of the rapper goaltender. The Ottawa Senators have worked furiously over the past 13 years cultivating an image as Canada's squeaky clean bilingual franchise, wrote Ken Campbell. And Ray Emery threatened to undo all that work in just a few short months. Early in the 2005-2006 NHL season, following a year-long lockout that cancelled the entire 2004-2005 campaign, Emery was the number 2 goaltender for the Ottawa Senators, behind future Hall of Famer Dominik Hasek. After rather short-lived stints in the league during the 2 previous seasons, Emery got off to an impressive start by winning his first 6 appearances of the year. That brought his career mark to 9-0, a league record for most consecutive wins from the start of a goaltender's time in the league. Clearly, Emery was showing signs of being the NHL starting caliber goalie that the Senators hoped he would become after signing him in 2001. However, it was some of Emery's early season office antics that started to ruffle the club's feathers. While the team was in Raleigh, North Carolina, for a road game against the eventual Stanley Cup champion Carolina Hurricanes, team captain Daniel Alfredson dared Emery to eat a cockroach for $500. He did. With that money, Emery paid for a new tattoo. Anger is a gift in graffiti style was now forever etched into the skin of his right arm. This tattoo joins several others on Emery's body, like his nickname, Razor, emblazoned across his chest, initials of his family members, an African symbol for the number 1. And his zodiac symbol, Libra. Emery openly admitted that he did not expect that the tattoos would be appreciated by everybody when he said, "The tattoos, I guess that fits into a different crowd than the stereotypical hockey player. I think maybe it's just that I might be of a newer generation. I kind of see it as being part of a different generation, a different upbringing." The tattoos are yet another mark of Emery's otherness. However, apparently the club was none too happy when a picture of Emery getting his new tattoo appeared the following day on the cover of the Ottawa Sun newspaper. Not wanting to get into a discussion about Emery's personal decision to get a tattoo, Senators general manager John Muckler said that he was more disappointed with the way it was handled, flaunted. You see, to Muckler, this was the kind of behavior that falls outside of what is expected of a professional hockey player. "I'm not going to get into a man's personal life," he added. "We're just trying to teach an individual what it takes to be a major league player. You have to work very hard at it, and to be successful in this business, it has to be his priority. He is a talented player, he has a lot of things going for him." Without having to read too hard between the lines, this message was clearly intended to let Emery know that he needed to start making better choices if he was going to be able to stick around the NHL and realize the potential he had for a successful career. The tattoos would be there forever. But Emery proved that he was a quick learner when the platinum blonde dye job he tried a few months later only lasted 1 day before he begrudgingly returned his hair to its natural color. As Alan Panzeri reported, why Emery changed his mind so quickly is a mystery, but it appears as if he got the hint that looking like the NHL's version of Dennis Rodman was not exactly the kind of image the Senators want to present. Emery's response was simply, I liked it, and that's all I'm going to say. This was just one more attempt at expressing his individuality that the club management nipped in the bud. Again, Emery's experience mirrored that of NBA players targeted by the dress code. We need to have our players look more professional to show more respect for the game and consumers, stated NBA Commissioner David Stern. Echoing John Muckler, Stern added, "That's just part of what we're trying to do to let the public know that our players are good people." The direct comparison to Dennis Rodman is also instructive. While Rodman is a complex cultural figure, he is an unmistakable embodiment of bad blackness. As Douglas Kellner points out, Rodman, with his bleached and undisciplined hair, earring, fancy clothes, and regularly rebellious behavior represents the bad black figure. The same could be said for Ray Emery. Blackness behind the mask. Hockey players, hidden under helmets and pads, can often seem removed from the viewing public. Goalies, hidden under larger helmets and even more pads, can seem anonymous. But their custom-made masks, professionally designed and painted for thousands of dollars, allow them to reveal a small part of their personalities. While basketball players simply flex their arms to show off their tattoos, hockey goalies simply nod their heads to model their masks. Lee Jenkins. Two boxing legends adorned Emery's early NHL goalie masks, one of the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, and the other of a more recent middleweight champion, Marvin Hagler. However, when Emery added a third boxing figure to his collection, Cam Cole's reaction captured the dominant sentiments of team officials and the public, even taking into account that goalies are not like normal people. Senators back up Ray Emery's ill-advised decision to have an image of wacko boxer Mike Tyson painted on his goal mask ranks among the dumbest ideas ever by an NHL player. Much like the platinum blonde hairdo Emery tried earlier in the season, his customized mask featuring the image of former heavyweight champ Mike Tyson had a shelf life of just one NHL game. Again, it was Senators General Manager John Muckler who intervened. "We didn't ask him not to wear the mask. We just had a discussion about what was right and what was wrong. He said he would take it off," claimed Muckler. Another news report stated, Muckler said he didn't demand that Emery remove the image of Tyson. Instead, he listened to Emery's point of view and then expressed his. In the end, Emery agreed that Muckler had a point. Emery told Muckler that he had chosen the image of Tyson because he admired Tyson as a boxer, and that he wasn't saying he was a role model. Tyson was the heavyweight champ when he was growing up, was a big deal and a lot of other people were fans of his. But to Muckler, and much of the viewing public, Tyson now represents a convicted rapist and a female abuser, not a boxing icon. Although, on one level, Tyson fits neatly within the chosen boxing theme that had previously been accepted on Emery's masks, the former champion's reputation, especially his 1992 conviction for rape, was sufficient to put his image over the line. As a result, Emery's Mike Tyson mask was never seen again. While it is easy to see why Tyson could be considered a boxing pariah and described as a vulgar and hideous man, the controversy surrounding Emery's goalie mask is more complex and nuanced than it first appears. To begin with, when we consider how other convicted criminals have been treated within the world of sport, especially white hockey players, there is some evidence to suggest that a double standard may be operating in comparison to a black offender like Tyson. At the very least, the hockey establishment appears to be demonstrating a degree of hypocrisy in terms of how it treats the issue of violence against women. Similar concerns could also be voiced in relation to the NHL's acceptance of other goalie mask art that might be considered offensive in ways that are analogous to the image of Mike Tyson. These examples raise the question of the degree to which the blackness of Tyson and Emery influenced perceptions of the controversial mask. First, in contrast to the strong backlash against Tyson, a number of NHL players returned successfully to the league almost immediately following their criminal transgressions. For instance, both Craig MacTavish in 1984 and Danny Heatley in 2005 were convicted of vehicular homicide in connection with fatal car accidents. After serving a one-year jail term, MacTavish went on to a lengthy playing and coaching career, mainly with the Edmonton Oilers. Meanwhile, Heatley has become a superstar in the NHL and has regularly represented Canada in international hockey competitions, including the 2006 and 2010 Olympic Winter Games. While the circumstances in each case are different, would Mike Tyson, or a guilty Ray Emery, have been accepted back into the NHL so easily? Although the Senators' quick move to prevent the glorification of Tyson might be seen as a positive step that demonstrates greater respect for women and a more careful consideration of the consequences of crimes such as sexual assault, the reception given to the Tyson mask also highlights the hockey establishment's failure to take similar crimes seriously on other occasions. The gap between the NHL's response to Tyson's image on a piece of equipment and hockey's usual treatment of violence against women is striking. For instance, in the book Crossing the Line, Violence and Sexual Assault in Canada's National Sport, Laura Robinson documents the horrific treatment of many young women by Canadian junior hockey players, including numerous acts of sexual abuse and sexual violence. She describes the hockey locker room as a rape culture, a place where females are referred to as groupies, puck bunnies, pucks, and dirties. Robinson shows that what is perhaps most notable about the sexual assault charges that have been brought against Canadian hockey players is how little alarm this has caused the sports media and hockey officials. The prevailing attitude was that the girls and women who came forward to police were troublemakers who thought that perhaps if they slept with hockey players they'd make into the NHL, as a wife or full-time groupie. If the hockey community condemned all acts of sexual abuse as decisively as it cracked down on Emery's Mike Tyson artwork, there would not be as much room to question why responses to the Tyson mask seem to be disproportionately strong. Similarly, reactions to Emery's use of Tyson's portrait must also be considered in the context of other potentially controversial masks worn by NHL goaltenders. For instance, Antero Niittymaki, a backup goalie for the Philadelphia Flyers, was apparently trying to overcome his mask envy when he had a customized mask painted depicting an unnamed mobster firing a Tommy gun. The spent shell casings cascade down the side of his mask. Meanwhile, John Graham of the Tampa Bay Lightning is trailed by a couple of buxom brunettes in what could be likened to a 1970s-style mural painted on the side of a van owned by one of those guys that parents would never let their daughters date. Yet, Emery is the only one to have experienced a case of mask censorship. Apparently, Mike Tyson's criminal background makes him an unacceptable image for mask artwork, but blazing machine guns and suggestive depictions of bikini-clad women are not violent or sexist enough to warrant censure. In light of these comparisons, we suggest that the virulent response to Ray Emery's Mike Tyson mask was heightened by concerns about the blackness of both men. As Leonard writes, blackness as hypersexual, as violent, as privileged, and as pollutant functions as the predominant trope for examining sexual violence. In a thorough examination of black male sexuality, Leonard demonstrates that the harrowing specter of the black rapist remains very much at the forefront of the public imagination. For instance, Leonard argues that a key subtext of the Kobe Bryant trial was the constant threat that black male bodies pose to white femininity. In some senses, white supremacist discourses play on a rape card that marks sexual violence as a crime of black men terrorizing white women. This stereotypical vision of a black man as a hypersexual brute clearly informs public perceptions of Mike Tyson. Regardless of Tyson's guilt or innocence, his public image has been shaped by demeaning racist archetypes that depict him as a crude, sex-obsessed, violent savage who could barely control his animal instincts. As John Emsloop explains, the multiple cultural representations that collectively constitute Mike Tyson positioned him as likely to be guilty of rape even before his trial began, mainly because the boxer fits comfortably in the cultural stereotype of the sexually insatiable black with an appetite that demands attention at any cost. Thus, in a hockey culture that, historically, has shown little respect for women, one can't help but detect a strong sense of irony in interpreting the erasure of an image of a black boxer on the mask of a black goaltender as a demonstration of the NHL's determination to address the issue of sexual violence against women. Policing blackness in the Great White North. Quite simply, many NBA fans, and even those on the periphery, have been turned off by too many tattooed, mean-talking toughs whose musical tastes include tunes that promote murder and misogyny. Hugh Adami, Ottawa Citizen. Many Canadians are reluctant to admit that racial oppression and inferiorization persist in this country, writes Joseph Mensah. As Canadians, we have the tendency not only to ignore our racist past, but also to dismiss any contemporary racial incidents as nothing but aberration in an essentially peaceful, tolerant, charitable, and egalitarian nation. As such, Canada is supposed to be a place where race never enters the equation. Robert Pitter suggests that something you learn growing up in Canada is that talking about racism is not the Canadian thing to do. When asked about it, Ray Emery also insists that race hasn't been much of a major issue in his career. He adds, "There have been a few isolated incidents, but I've not made a team or anything like that because of it, it was just because I wasn't good enough. There are different, stupid things people yell, but you don't really hear them." Moreover, although Canada's official federal government policy of multiculturalism is intended to legitimize and affirm the country's cultural and racial pluralism, Canadians appear deeply ambivalent about the public recognition of other cultures, the freedom of non-white racial and non-European cultural groups to maintain their unique identities, and the right of minorities to function in a society free of racism. Despite long-standing myths that Canada struggles with fewer racial problems and exhibits less racism than the United States, racial attitudes, prejudices, and discrimination are actually very similar between the two countries. This case study of media narratives related to NHL goaltender Ray Emery suggests that there are also significant parallels between Canadian and American responses to issues surrounding race in sport. In both hockey and basketball during the 2005-2006 season, the blackness of male athletes was constructed as menacing and threatening, as a pollutant that requires surveillance and control. In each situation, the relevance of race was downplayed or denied and masked by references to professionalism, business success, and major league attitudes. This denial or minimization of racism is a key frame through which democratic or colorblind racism is expressed. For instance, Marcia C. Smith stated that, with the NBA dress code, David Stern was merely doing sound business by infusing more professionalism and corporate conservatism into the league. It's called being professional on and off the court, claimed Terrence Moore. That's all the NBA is asking players to do. In his dealings with Emery, Senators General Manager John McClure took a similar approach. He continually tried to make it clear that he wasn't getting personal. He never ordered Emery to change his hair color or lose the Tyson mask, and his response to Emery was definitely not about race. We told him that he was our second goaltender at the time and that he had to be a good professional in every way, stated head coach Brian Murray. Not that he wasn't. He was a young guy with a little time on his hands. We told him, if you want attention, get it with your ability to play. Put simply, McClure and Murray claimed that they were merely looking out for Emery's best interests, trying to ensure that he knew how to be a professional in the NHL. However, at least one Ottawa journalist offered a counter-narrative that subtly suggested that Emery's race may have been a factor in how he was treated over the course of the season. Emery was also criticized for bleaching his hair earlier this year, wrote Wayne Scanlon. But didn't Brian Smolinski, a white player, do the same thing a while back, without a hue and cry over it? Yesterday, former NHL defenseman Gary Galley raised a good question on the radio. If Dominik Hasek, a white goaltender, had a Tyson logo on his goalie helmet, would it have become a big deal? Or would everyone dismiss it as just a flaky move by lovable Dom? As Brian Wilson showed in his work on representations of black basketball players with the Toronto Raptors, we hope that what has become clear in this chapter are the ways in which some of the subtle, newer forms of racism evident in American sporting contexts like the NBA are also pertinent to the Canadian context as well as in the historically white sport of ice hockey. We also hope that a better understanding of the social construction of racism has been attained through this case study. Race scholars have been consistent in urging us to rethink or reimagine blackness as a legitimate part of contemporary and historical Canadian culture as well as Canadian sport cultures like hockey. But, as this chapter suggests, at present we seem to have difficulty thinking of blackness in terms other than derogatory or threatening stereotypes. According to Henry and Tater, the new racism rarely demonstrates itself in violence or overt racist behavior. Instead, it manifests itself in more subtle and insidious ways and is largely invisible to those who are part of the dominant culture. This study has made visible some of the subtle and insidious ways in which the new racism operates in contemporary sport by assessing the media discourses around Ray Emery. Drawing upon David J. Leonard's analysis of the recent history of the NBA, we see the treatment of Emery as part of larger and long-standing reactionary cultural and ideological projects that blame black culture, in this case hip-hop, for the pollution, corruption, and denigration of American, and, in this case, Canadian, life. Leonard adds, just as crime signifies blackness and vice versa, blackness has come to embody a pollutant within the NBA that necessitates surveillance and regulation. Ray Emery's blackness also came to be seen as a pollutant within the NHL, and the Ottawa Senators did their best to keep their gangs-to-goalies behavior in check. As Gary Wannell observes, examination of representations of black sportsmen still tends to suggest that, for them, the rules are different, the conventions more strict and the options more limited. Thus, like many other black male athletes, Emery was perceived as a bad boy whose behavior and style of dress and adornment pushes at the boundaries. Our analysis in this chapter also supports Abdel Shahid's characterization of Canadian hockey as a sport whose white core is under constant siege from a series of villains. These villains include any form of masculinity marked as effeminate, and any form of popular culture marked as foreign or homosexual. As a result, Stephen Brunt's description of the NBA dress code in the fall of 2005 as an effort to whiten up the NBA, to dilute its hip-hop aspect, to appeal to a wide audience that might otherwise be scared off by the image of young, black men in street fashion strangely foreshadowed the threat that the Dennis Rodman of hockey, obviously a foreign influence, would soon pose to the NHL. Finally, the questions raised about Emery during the 2005-2006 season are relevant to Pitter's consideration of the barriers encountered by black and Aboriginal players in Canadian hockey, and the significance of racialized identities to the very idea of being Canadian. Media narratives of Emery's experience not only contributed to cultural constructions of blackness in Canada and in hockey, they also demonstrated that such cultural constructions could be mobilized to constrain certain racialized forms of expression. Perhaps the way that Ray Emery played the game was not white enough, or Canadian enough to earn full acceptance within the culture of hockey. Enough to earn full acceptance within the culture of hockey. Enough to earn full acceptance within the culture of hockey. Enough to earn full acceptance within the culture of hockey. Enough to earn full